Samuel Brooks thought surviving quietly was enough. At 64, the homeless black man moved through the frozen streets of Cleveland with only one companion, Buddy, the small dog he had rescued when he had nothing left. On a bitter winter night, Samuel entered an abandoned construction site not to steal but to protect Buddy from the cold. By morning, compassion was labeled a crime. What followed revealed how easily dignity disappears when power meets prejudice. This is not just a story about a man and his dog. It's about how we treat one another and why silence is often mistaken for guilt. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. Winter came hard to Cleveland that year. The wind rolled in from Lake Erie like a warning that no one could silence, pushing snow sideways through the streets and piling it against abandoned storefronts and rusted railings. The River District, once loud with factories and ship horns, lay half-dark now. Streetlights flickering, windows boarded up, the city breathing slowly under a white shroud. It was the kind of cold that did not merely bite the skin. It reached inward, into memory, into bone. Samuel Brooks walked carefully along the river path, his boots cracked and softened by years of use. He was 64, tall once, now slightly stooped, with shoulders that had learned to fold inward as if to apologize for existing. His skin was dark, weathered, marked by deep lines that told a quieter story than the city around him. A thin, gray beard framed his jaw, untrimmed but clean, and his hair, once thick and black, had surrendered to time, leaving close-cropped silver curls beneath a knit cap that had lost its elasticity years ago. Samuel did not hurry. He never hurried anymore. The streets had taught him that rushing only led to mistakes. At his side trotted Buddy. Buddy was a small mixed-breed dog, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with a graying muzzle and uneven ears, one that stood alert, the other that drooped slightly as if undecided about the world. His fur was a patchwork of brown, white, and black, thick but poorly insulated against a night like this. His eyes were dark and watchful, carrying the kind of intelligence that came from having once been abandoned and learning to survive anyway. Samuel had found him 2 winters earlier behind a closed grocery store, shivering inside a cardboard box soaked through with melted snow. Neither of them had been saved that night. They had simply chosen each other. Buddy slowed, his steps shortening. He paused, lifted one paw, and whimpered. A small, involuntary sound that Samuel felt in his chest before he heard it. Samuel stopped. "You okay, old man?" he asked softly, though he knew the answer. Buddy's body trembled now, the cold finally winning its argument. Samuel knelt despite the ache in his knees and wrapped his scarf more tightly around the dog's thin frame. He rubbed Buddy's sides with careful hands the way he once warmed engine blocks in winter mornings at the factory. Slow, patient, respectful. "I know," Samuel murmured. "I know." He scanned the street. The shelters would be full by now. They always were when the temperature dropped this low, and even if there was space, Buddy wouldn't be allowed inside. That rule had never changed. Samuel rose, his breath fogging the air, and made a decision he had been avoiding all evening. 2 blocks away stood the old warehouse. The building had once been a shipping hub, then a storage facility, and now, according to the banners tied loosely to its chain-link fence, a redevelopment project. The signs promised new apartments, new life, new beginnings. But on nights like this, it was just a concrete shell, unfinished and silent. Samuel approached the fence cautiously. A section had been pushed loose near the back, likely by someone else with nowhere else to go. He hesitated only a moment before guiding Buddy through the opening. Inside, the warehouse smelled of dust, old metal, and damp wood. Snow had blown in through broken windows, dusting the floor in pale sheets. Samuel found a corner shielded from the wind, laid down flattened cardboard he'd been carrying under his coat, and lowered himself carefully. Buddy curled against him immediately, pressing his small body into Samuel's chest. "It's just for the night. Samuel whispered. "Just until morning." He wrapped his coat around them both and closed his eyes. Across the city, Emily Carter pulled her car to the side of the road and turned off the engine. Emily was 28, tall and slender, with auburn hair tied into a practical ponytail that brushed the collar of her coat. Her face was open and expressive. Freckles scattered lightly across her cheeks, though tonight they were flushed red from the cold. She wore sensible boots, a thick scarf, and the nervous determination of someone still trying to prove, to herself most of all, that she belonged where she stood. It was her 3rd week as a social worker with the city, her first winter. She stepped out into the snow, clipboard tucked under her arm, breath catching as the wind cut through her coat. She moved between alleys and doorways, checking places she had been told people might shelter. A few nodded politely when she offered information cards. Others turned away, tired of promises that never lasted past sunrise. When she reached the river district, it was already too quiet. Emily paused, staring down the empty path, snow filling in footprints almost as soon as they were made. She scribbled notes, frustration tightening her jaw. "Too late again," she whispered. She didn't know Samuel Brooks. She didn't know Buddy, but somewhere in her chest she felt the weight of their absence. Miles away in a warm living room overlooking a different part of the city, Daniel Wright leaned forward in his chair. Daniel was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with a solid build shaped by years of manual work before success softened his hands. His hair was dark, carefully trimmed, flecked with gray at the temples. He wore a simple sweater and jeans, nothing that suggested wealth except the quiet confidence of someone who no longer worried about survival. The security monitor glowed in front of him. Camera feeds from the warehouse flickered across the screen. Static, empty corridors, snow drifting in through broken glass. Then, in the far corner of one frame, movement. Daniel leaned closer. A figure. Slow, careful, human. He watched as the man settled into a corner, wrapping himself around something small. A dog, he realized after a moment. Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew that corner. He had slept in places like that once. Before the contracts, before the company, before life decided to offer him another chance. He reached for his phone, thumb hovering over the screen. Then he stopped. "They'll survive the night," he muttered to himself. "Just one night." Daniel turned off the monitor and stared into the dark reflection of the screen longer than he meant to. Back in the warehouse, Samuel woke briefly when the wind howled louder, rattling the metal beams overhead. He adjusted his coat, shielding Buddy's head with his arm. The dog sighed, finally still. Samuel did not sleep again. He lay there, eyes open, counting breaths, waiting for the cold to loosen its grip. Morning would come. It always did. And with it, consequences he could not yet see. Morning did not arrive gently. It came with the scrape of boots on concrete and the sharp clatter of metal echoing through the unfinished warehouse. Samuel Brooks stirred from a shallow, restless doze, his body stiff from the cold and the hard floor. Light filtered in through the broken windows, pale and unforgiving, turning the drifting snow into a thin mist that hung in the air. Buddy lifted his head first, ears twitching, his breath quick and shallow. Samuel pushed himself upright, wrapping his coat tighter around the dog. "Easy," he whispered, more to steady himself than Buddy. The night had ended. Whatever came next would not be kind. Voices followed, 3 of them, loud, impatient, carrying the authority of uniforms. They belonged to men who had already decided how this would go. Officer Mark Hale entered first. He was in his late 30s, tall, broad-shouldered, with a square jaw and closely cropped dark hair. His face carried a permanent scowl, the kind shaped by years of believing the world owed him obedience. He moved with confidence that bordered on arrogance, scanning the space as if it already belonged to him. Behind him came Officer Ryan Collins, younger, maybe 26, with pale skin reddened by the cold and restless eyes that never seemed to settle. He held his baton loosely, spinning it once in his hand, a nervous habit masked as casual dominance. His mouth curled into a half-smile that suggested amusement rather than duty. The third was Officer Thomas Becker, older than the other two, with thinning blonde hair and a heavy build that strained against his jacket. He walked slower, his expression unreadable, eyes flicking briefly toward Samuel before sliding away. Becker had been on the force long enough to know when something felt wrong, but not long enough, or brave enough, to challenge it. "Well, look what we got here," Hale said, his voice sharp and loud. "Morning surprise." Samuel stood carefully, keeping Buddy close to his legs. He raised his hands slightly, palms open. "We're leaving," he said calmly. "Just needed somewhere warm for the night." Collins laughed. "That's so? Funny how people always say that." Becker glanced around. "This is an active construction site," he said almost mechanically. "You know that, right?" Samuel nodded. "Yes, sir. I didn't touch anything. We didn't take anything." Hale stepped closer, invading Samuel's space. "We'll be the judge of that." Buddy whimpered, pressing against Samuel's shin. Hale noticed and smirked. "What's this? You running a kennel in here now?" Before Samuel could respond, Collins moved past him and kicked the small metal bowl Buddy used for water. It clanged loudly and skidded across the floor, spilling what little water remained onto the concrete. "Hey," Samuel said, his voice tightening. "Don't do that." Collins shrugged. "Oops." Hale laughed. "Relax, old man. Dog can find another puddle." Becker shifted his weight, eyes lingering on the spilled water for a moment too long. He said nothing. Hale pointed at the torn blanket Samuel had laid on the ground. "What's this? You making yourself comfortable?" He stepped down hard, grinding his boot into the thin fabric, smearing it with dirt and melting snow. Collins joined in, laughing openly now. Samuel felt something crack. Not loud, not visible, but real. Still, he stayed where he was. "We're leaving," he repeated. "Please." Hale's smile vanished. "Too late for that." He grabbed Samuel's arm and twisted it behind his back with practiced ease. Samuel gasped as pain shot through his shoulder. Collins snapped the cuffs on, metal biting into old wrists that had already given enough to the world. Buddy barked once, sharp and frightened, then fell silent as Collins stepped toward him. Samuel leaned forward instinctively, but Hale shoved him back. "Control your animal!" Hale snapped. "He's scared," Samuel said. "That's all?" "Then you should have thought about that before breaking the law," Hale replied. Becker cleared his throat. "You want to tell him what he's being charged with?" Hale nodded. "Trespassing. Possible theft of materials. We'll let the station sort it out." "There's nothing missing," Samuel said. "Check, please." Collins scoffed. "You always say that." From behind a stack of plywood near the far wall, someone watched. Miguel Alvarez was a construction worker in his early 40s, lean and wiry with dark hair streaked with gray and hands roughened by decades of labor. He had come early to pick up tools before the crew arrived, hoping to finish a job and get home before the storm worsened again. He stood frozen now, half-hidden, heart pounding. Miguel recognized the man. He had seen him before, along the river, always with the dog, always quiet. He had never caused trouble. Miguel opened his mouth, then closed it. He had a daughter in college, a mortgage, a supervisor who watched everything. He told himself it wasn't his place. He told himself someone else would speak up. He stayed silent. Hale marched Samuel toward the exit. But he followed as best he could, nails scraping against the concrete, confusion clouding his eyes. Collins grabbed the dog's leash and yanked it short. "Dog goes to animal control," Collins said. "Policy." "No," Samuel said sharply, the word tearing free before he could stop it. "Please, he won't survive there." Hale stopped and turned. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, annoyance, maybe even doubt, but it vanished quickly. "You should have thought of that, too." Becker looked away. Outside, the cold hit harder. Snow crunched beneath their boots as they led Samuel across the open lot. The city beyond the fence looked distant, unreal, as if it belonged to someone else's life. Inside the patrol car, Samuel sat stiffly, hands cuffed in front of him now. Buddy curled at his feet in the back seat, leash looped tight around the metal divider. The engine idled. Hale spoke into his radio, voice casual as though nothing of consequence was happening. Above them all, unseen, the cameras continued to record. The grainy lenses captured every shove, every laugh, every moment of quiet humiliation. The footage saved itself automatically, time-stamped and filed away. No one watched it. Yet. The courthouse rose from the street like a block of winter stone, gray and unmoved by the weather or the people who passed through its doors. Snow had been cleared from the steps, leaving wet patches that reflected the dull morning light. Samuel Brooks stood at the base of those steps with Buddy pressed close to his leg, the dog's small body tense beneath the thin leash. The cold here felt different. Not sharper, but heavier, as if the building itself carried a weight that pressed down on those approaching it. Samuel had been given a borrowed coat from the holding room, but it hung awkwardly on his frame, sleeves too long, collar frayed. The cuffs still marked his wrists faintly, purple shadows beneath dark skin. His posture remained calm, shoulders squared out of habit rather than confidence. He had learned long ago that appearing steady was often mistaken for being unbreakable. Buddy sensed the change in environment immediately. His ears flattened, and his breathing grew shallow. He glanced up at Samuel with dark, searching eyes, then nudged closer, his body seeking the familiar warmth of Samuel's leg. Buddy was not young anymore. His muzzle had gone pale early, and his joints stiffened when the weather turned. Shelters and loud places frightened him. Memories of cages, shouting voices, and being moved without understanding had left their mark. At the entrance, a woman in a navy blue uniform stood beside the security checkpoint. Her name badge read, Clerk A. Morrison. She was in her early 50s, average height with short blonde hair cut neatly above her collar. Her face held the practiced neutrality of someone who had delivered bad news too many times to count. Lines around her eyes suggested long hours and little patience for complications. To her, rules were not cruel. They were efficient. She glanced down at Buddy, then back at Samuel. "Animals aren't allowed inside the courtroom," she said flatly. "The dog will need to be taken to temporary holding." Samuel didn't respond at first. He looked at Buddy, then at the woman, as if translating her words into something real. "Temporary holding," he repeated quietly. "Yes," Morrison said, already reaching for a form. "Animal control is on call." Buddy trembled. He pressed forward, slipping his head beneath Samuel's coat, forcing his way into the worn fabric until his nose rested against Samuel's chest. The movement was instinctive, desperate. Samuel felt the shaking immediately, felt the small heartbeat racing against his own ribs. "No," Samuel said. Morrison paused, pen hovering. "Sir, I'm not asking, this is procedure." Samuel swallowed. For years, his voice had stayed low. Careful, trained to avoid escalation. He had learned when to disappear, when to nod, when to accept what could not be changed. But this was different. He tightened his arms around Buddy, feeling the dog's weight, light and fragile. "If you take him," Samuel said louder now, "I'm not going in." The words surprised even him. They echoed slightly against the stone walls. Morrison looked up, irritation flickering across her face. "You don't get to make demands here," she said. "If you refuse to enter, that will be noted." "Then note it," Samuel replied. His voice was steady, but something fierce had entered it, something old and buried. "He stays with me or I stay out here." A few people nearby slowed their steps. Heads turned. The morning routine of the courthouse hesitated just slightly. Across the plaza, Emily Carter stopped walking. She had not planned to be at the courthouse that morning. Her supervisor had sent her to drop off paperwork for an unrelated case, nothing more. She wore the same sensible coat and boots as before, her auburn hair tucked beneath a knitted hat. Her face looked tired today, shadows beneath her eyes from too many nights replaying faces she could not forget. Emily froze when she saw the man at the entrance. It took her a moment to be sure. Then her breath caught. "That's him," she whispered. She remembered Samuel Brooks clearly now. The quiet man by the river, the dog always at his side. She had noticed him weeks ago, made a note in her file, planned to return with resources and time. Then the storm hit, cases piled up, and she never went back. Guilt tightened her chest. She stepped closer just as a man with a camera slung around his neck raised it hesitantly. The reporter was James Lowell, early 30s, tall and thin, with wire-rimmed glasses and a coat that looked one winter away from falling apart. His hair was perpetually unkempt, not out of style but out of distraction. James worked for a small local paper, the kind that survived on late-night editing and unpaid overtime. He had learned to recognize moments that didn't fit neatly into routine. This one didn't. He lifted his camera, snapping a single photo of Samuel holding the trembling dog. He didn't know why yet, only that something about the scene felt wrong. Morrison cleared her throat. "Sir, last warning." Samuel met her gaze. "I'm not leaving him." Behind Morrison, 2 security guards shifted. One of them, Paul Denton, a stocky man in his 40s with tired eyes and a shaved head, hesitated. He had seen people lose everything in that building. He glanced at Buddy, then away. Emily stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice polite but firm. "I'm with the City Outreach Program. That dog is his emotional support. Separating them could cause serious distress." Morrison turned sharply. "Are you officially assigned to this case?" Emily hesitated. "Not yet." "Then step aside." Samuel felt Buddy's shaking intensify. He bent slightly, resting his forehead against the dog's head. "It's okay," he murmured, though he wasn't sure to whom he was speaking. James snapped another photo. For a moment, no one moved. Then Morrison exhaled sharply. "Fine," she said. "Stand there. I'll inform the court that the defendant is refusing to enter." Samuel nodded once. He did not let go of Buddy. Emily stood beside him now, close enough that he could feel her presence, though she did not touch him. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have found you sooner." Samuel looked at her, recognition dawning slowly. "You came by the river," he said. Emily nodded. "I did." Inside the building, a clerk hurried away with a clipboard. Somewhere deeper within the courthouse, doors opened and closed, voices rose and fell. Time stretched thin. James lowered his camera, watching Samuel carefully. "Sir," he said gently, "can I ask why the dog matters so much?" Samuel didn't answer immediately. He stroked Buddy's back, fingers moving through fur worn thin by age and weather. "Because he stayed," he said finally, "when everything else didn't." James wrote that down. The cold crept back in, settling around them. Samuel remained where he was, rooted, unmoving. Buddy stayed pressed to his chest, breathing slowly now, comforted by the one thing he trusted. The courthouse doors loomed ahead, closed but waiting. Samuel did not step forward. The courtroom was smaller than Samuel Brooks had imagined, narrower, with benches worn smooth by decades of shifting bodies and restless hands. Pale light filtered through tall windows, casting long, cold lines across the wooden floor. When Samuel finally stepped inside, Buddy still pressed against his chest. The murmurs followed him like a tide that didn't quite dare to rise. The air smelled faintly of old paper, polish, and something heavier. Anticipation, maybe, or judgment waiting to be spoken aloud. At the front of the room sat Judge Maria Lopez. She was in her late 50s, of average height when standing, with a straight-backed posture that suggested discipline learned early and never abandoned. Her hair, dark and streaked with silver, was pulled back into a neat bun. Her face carried fine lines that spoke not of softness, but of long days spent listening carefully before deciding. Raised in a working-class neighborhood by immigrant parents, Maria Lopez had learned young that rules mattered. But so did people. It was a balance she guarded fiercely. Her eyes, sharp and observant, moved from Samuel to Buddy and back again, pausing just a fraction longer than procedure required. Samuel stood at the defense table, the borrowed coat still hanging awkwardly from his shoulders. He held Buddy close, one arm wrapped protectively around the dog's small frame. Buddy's trembling had eased, replaced by a tense stillness, his head tucked beneath Samuel's chin. Samuel felt every breath the dog took, slow and shallow, as if afraid that making noise would invite separation. "State your name," the clerk said. "Samuel Brooks," he replied, voice steady. Judge Lopez leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "you have been charged with trespassing and theft of construction materials. Before we proceed, there is an issue regarding the animal." A murmur rippled through the benches. Samuel felt it like a physical pressure. "He's not an animal to me," Samuel said quietly before he could stop himself. The judge raised a hand, not in warning but in acknowledgement. "I understand," she said, "but the court has policies." Samuel swallowed. He tightened his hold on Buddy and looked up, meeting the judge's eyes directly. Years ago, he would have looked down. Years ago, he would have accepted whatever came next without resistance. But those years had taken too much already. "He's all I have left," Samuel said. His voice was louder now, clear enough to carry to the back of the room. "I'm not asking for mercy, I'm asking to keep what little I still have. Please, let him stay with me." The courtroom stirred. A woman in the second row dabbed at her eyes. Someone coughed. A few people shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the uniformed officers seated along the side wall. Judge Lopez studied Samuel carefully. She saw the restraint in his posture, the way his hands trembled only slightly despite the strain. She saw the dog pressed against him, old and thin and utterly dependent. And she saw something else, too, something she had seen many times before but never ignored. Before she could speak, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. The sound cut through the murmurs like a blade. Daniel Wright stepped inside. He wore a simple dark coat and carried a small black laptop bag in his right hand. He moved with purpose, but not arrogance. His broad shoulders squared, his expression serious. Daniel was a man accustomed to being listened to, but he did not enjoy the attention that followed him now. As he walked down the aisle, whispers followed. "That's the contractor." "What's he doing here?" Daniel stopped near the front and addressed the bailiff quietly. After a brief exchange, the bailiff nodded and spoke to the judge. Judge Lopez's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mr. Wright," she said, "you're the owner of the construction site in question." "Yes, Your Honor," Daniel replied. His voice was steady, but his jaw was tight. "I believe I have evidence relevant to this case." The prosecutor shifted, irritation flickering across his face. The defense attorney looked up sharply. Daniel set his bag down and opened it, removing a laptop. "The warehouse is equipped with security cameras," he continued. "I reviewed the footage after learning of the charges." He paused, then added, "I should say, I didn't call the police that night. I saw the man enter with his dog. I knew why he was there." A murmur spread again, louder this time. Judge Lopez nodded once. "Proceed." The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. Grainy footage appeared. The dark interior of the warehouse, snow drifting through broken windows. Then Samuel and Buddy entered the frame, slow and cautious, clearly exhausted. The footage showed them settling into the corner, touching nothing else, taking nothing. Then the morning footage played. The officers' voices echoed faintly from the speakers. The shove, the cuffs, the kick that sent Buddy's water bowl skidding across the floor, the boot grinding into the blanket. The courtroom went silent. Not the polite silence of procedure, but the heavy kind that presses on the chest and refuses to let go. Daniel stood beside the screen, hands clasped loosely in front of him. "I grew up homeless," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Not for long, but long enough to know what desperation looks like. Long enough to recognize it when I see it." He looked at Samuel then, just briefly. That man wasn't stealing. He was surviving. Judge Lopez leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on the screen as the footage ended. When she spoke again, her voice was controlled but firm. "This court recognizes the video as evidence." Emily Carter sat near the aisle, her phone hidden in her coat pocket. While the room focused on the screen, she typed a short message with trembling fingers, sending it to a local animal welfare organization she had worked with before. Her face remained composed, but her heart raced. She knew better than to draw attention now. This moment belonged to Samuel. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Your Honor, with respect, the officers were following protocol." "Protocol does not excuse cruelty," Judge Lopez said sharply. Her gaze swept the room, landing briefly on the officers seated stiffly along the wall. None of them met her eyes. Samuel stood motionless. He felt as though the floor beneath him had disappeared, replaced by something fragile and uncertain. Buddy shifted slightly, sensing the change in the room, but did not pull away. Judge Lopez looked at Samuel again. Her voice softened, not with pity but with clarity. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "this court is not blind to circumstance, nor is it deaf to truth." She paused, letting the words settle. "This is not a crime," she continued. "This is a plea for help." No one spoke. The courtroom remained silent, holding its breath. The video did not end when the warehouse lights flickered on. It lingered, unblinking, patient in the way machines are patient. The screen at the front of the courtroom held the final frame. Samuel Brooks standing with his hands raised, Buddy pressed against his leg, the concrete floor glistening with spilled water. The image froze there, as if refusing to let the room look away. No one spoke. The silence was not polite or procedural. It was heavy, collective, and deeply uncomfortable. It pressed against ribs and throats alike. Even the old clock above the clerk's desk seemed to hesitate before its next tick. Judge Maria Lopez did not move at first. Her hands rested flat on the bench, fingers relaxed but grounded, the posture of someone who had learned to wait for truth to settle before naming it. Her eyes traveled the room, over the prosecutor's stiff shoulders, across the rows of spectators, and finally to the line of uniformed officers seated along the wall. She did not rush. She never rushed. Samuel stood where he had been, Buddy still in his arms. He felt the room change around him, felt something uncoil that had been tight since the morning. He did not smile. He did not exhale. Years of living quietly had taught him not to trust sudden shifts. He only held the dog closer, his thumb moving in small circles along Buddy's spine, counting breaths. On the benches, James Lowell leaned forward, pen moving fast across his notebook. His glasses slid down the bridge of his nose, forgotten. He wrote not just what he saw, but what he felt, the way the room held its breath, the way truth rearranged the air. James had chased stories long enough to know when facts became something larger. He underlined a sentence twice and kept writing. Near the aisle, Emily Carter watched the officers' faces as the video replayed the morning sequence again. Slower this time. The shove, the cuffs, the laughter. Emily's jaw tightened. She had seen power misused before, quietly, bureaucratically, but this was naked, undeniable. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket, a reply from the animal welfare organization confirming they were standing by. She did not check it. This moment did not belong to logistics. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he began, his voice thin in the stillness, "while the footage is concerning, it does not conclusively prove intent on the part of the officers." Judge Lopez raised a hand. The gesture was small, but it stopped him completely. "I am not interested in intent," she said evenly. "I am interested in actions." She gestured toward the screen. "The video shows no theft, no attempt to remove materials, no damage to property. It shows a man seeking shelter with his dog. It also shows the use of force where none was required." A murmur rippled through the benches again, quickly subdued. Among the officers seated along the wall, one young man stared at the floor. Officer Lucas Reed was barely 23, his uniform still stiff with newness. He had been assigned to courthouse duty that week, far from the morning arrest. His hair was light brown, cut short, his face open in a way that had not yet learned how to close itself off. He had joined the force believing in service, in protection. Watching the footage, something twisted in his chest. When Judge Lopez's eyes swept the room again, Lucas lowered his head, shame warming his ears. Beside him, Officer Becker sat rigid, his jaw clenched. He had seen this coming the moment the video started. He told himself he had followed orders. He told himself silence was safer. Neither thought offered comfort now. Daniel Wright remained standing near the screen, hands clasped behind his back. He did not look triumphant. If anything, he looked older. The memory he had shared, of nights spent sleeping wherever he could, had not been planned. It had simply surfaced, pulled forward by recognition. He wondered how many people in the room had ever known what it meant to choose between warmth and legality. Judge Lopez leaned forward. "This court has a responsibility," she said, her voice measured, deliberate. "Not only to apply the law, but to understand the reality in which it operates." She turned to Samuel. "Mr. Brooks, you entered a restricted site. That fact is not disputed." Samuel nodded once. "Yes, ma'am. But," she continued, "the law does not exist in a vacuum. Context matters. Humanity matters." She paused, allowing the words to find their place. "This is not a crime," Judge Lopez said slowly. "This is a cry for help." The words landed with weight, echoing softly against the walls. James's pen froze. Then he wrote them down exactly as spoken. The prosecutor tried again, weaker now. "Your Honor, the officer's conduct will be addressed separately," Judge Lopez said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "What concerns me here is the charge against this man." She looked back to the screen, then to Samuel, then to Buddy, who had lifted his head slightly as if sensing the tension ease. "Based on the evidence presented," she continued, "this court finds no basis for the theft charge, nor does it find that the trespass, under these circumstances, constitutes criminal intent." A collective exhale moved through the room, barely audible but unmistakable. Emily closed her eyes briefly, relief washing through her in a wave she hadn't allowed herself to anticipate. Judge Lopez was not finished. "The footage also raises serious questions about the conduct of the arresting officers," she said. Her gaze hardened. "Questions this court cannot ignore." The officers along the wall stiffened. Lucas Reed swallowed hard, his eyes still fixed on the floor. Judge Lopez's voice softened again, not with mercy, but with gravity. "Authority exists to protect the vulnerable, not to humiliate them." Samuel felt Buddy relax, fully for the first time since the morning. The dog shifted, turning his head to press his nose beneath Samuel's chin, a quiet gesture of trust. Samuel closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sensation ground him. Across the aisle, James Lowell finished his notes and looked up. He met Emily's eyes briefly. She nodded once. They both understood what this meant, not just for Samuel, but beyond him. Stories like this did not stay contained. They moved. The bailiff shifted, waiting for instruction. Judge Lopez glanced toward him, then back to the room. "We will take a brief recess," she said. "This court will reconvene shortly." Her gavel tapped once, sharp and final. As people stood, the silence broke into low murmurs, conversations erupting in hushed tones. James slipped his notebook into his coat, already planning his opening paragraph. Emily stepped closer to Samuel, careful not to crowd him. "You did the right thing," she said quietly. Samuel nodded, though his eyes remained on Buddy. "I didn't do anything," he replied. "I just stayed." Daniel approached, stopping a respectful distance away. "I'm glad I came," he said. It wasn't a boast. It was an admission. Samuel met his gaze for the first time. "So am I," he said. The truth had been shown. It could not be folded away again. And for the first time in a long while, Samuel felt the ground beneath him steady. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted. The murmurs that once filled the benches were gone, replaced by a focused stillness that felt deliberate, almost respectful. People sat straighter, even the air seemed to wait. Judge Maria Lopez returned to the bench with the same composed posture she always carried, but there was a firmness now that left no doubt about what was coming. She adjusted her glasses, glanced once at the file before her, and then looked directly at Samuel Brooks. Samuel stood with Buddy held securely in his arms. The dog's breathing was slow and even, his body warm against Samuel's chest. Samuel felt the steadiness of it, the simple proof of life that had kept him standing through the longest hours of the day. He did not dare hope yet. Hope, he had learned, was a fragile thing. Judge Lopez spoke clearly. After reviewing the evidence presented, including the security footage and witness statements, this court finds no basis for the charges brought against Mr. Samuel Brooks. A ripple passed through the room, quickly stifled. "All charges are hereby dismissed," she continued, besmirched. "Mr. Brooks is found not guilty." The words landed softly, without flourish. But to Samuel they struck like a bell he had not heard in years. He did not move at first. His fingers tightened around Buddy's fur as if to anchor himself in the moment. Then his shoulders sagged, just slightly, as something he had been carrying for too long finally loosened. Judge Lopez was not finished. "This court also finds the conduct of the arresting officers to be deeply concerning," she said, her tone firm, each word measured. "Based on the evidence, the officers involved acted with unnecessary force and demonstrated behavior inconsistent with the standards expected of public servants." She turned her gaze toward the three officers seated along the wall. Officer Mark Hale sat rigid, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed straight ahead. The confidence that had once defined his posture was gone, replaced by something brittle and defensive. Officer Ryan Collins shifted in his seat, his earlier smirk long erased, hands fidgeting with the edge of his uniform sleeve. Officer Thomas Becker stared at the floor, his shoulders slumped, the weight of inaction finally pressing down on him. Judge Lopez continued. "Effective immediately, Officers Hale, Collins, and Becker are relieved of duty pending further administrative action." A sharp intake of breath came from somewhere in the back of the room. "They are terminated from active service," she added, her voice unwavering, "and are hereby sentenced to 120 hours of court-ordered community service to be served at the city sanitation and waste management site." The silence that followed was absolute. Officer Lucas Reed, seated among the other officers not involved, lowered his head further. His cheeks burned, not with fear, but with a sense of reckoning. He thought of the oath he had taken only months before, and wondered how easily it could be bent or broken. Judge Lopez let the silence do its work before she spoke again. "This court will not tolerate discrimination, abuse of power, or cruelty disguised as duty." She raised the gavel. "Court is adjourned." The sound echoed once, clean and final. For a moment no one moved. Then the room erupted. Not in cheers, but in voices overlapping, breath released, tension breaking. People stood, some clapping quietly, others simply watching Samuel as if they needed to see him still standing. James Lowell was already typing furiously on his phone, his notebook forgotten in his coat pocket. His article had written itself in his mind the moment the verdict was spoken. He knew the headline would spread fast, faster than the small paper he worked for ever had before. Across the room, a television camera operator adjusted focus. The local station had arrived during the recess, drawn by whispers and text and a sense that something larger was unfolding. Within minutes, clips of the verdict were broadcast across the city. Outside the courthouse, screens lit up in diners, barbershops, and living rooms. Social media filled with grainy footage of the video evidence, slowed and replayed, captions multiplying by the second. The phrase, "This is not a crime. This is a cry for help," spread faster than anyone could track. In City Hall, phones began ringing. By mid-afternoon, the mayor's office released a brief statement announcing a comprehensive investigation into discriminatory practices within the police department. Committees were formed. Oversight boards were scheduled. Promises were made, cautious and public. None of that reached Samuel immediately. He stood near the exit of the courtroom, overwhelmed by movement and sound, Buddy still in his arms. Emily Carter approached him carefully. She looked relieved, but there was determination in her eyes now, too. "You're free," she said softly, as if saying it too loudly might break it. Samuel nodded. "I think I always was," he replied, though his voice trembled. Daniel Wright shook Samuel's hand, his grip firm and respectful. "You did nothing wrong," he said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Samuel met his gaze. "Thank you," he said simply. As the officers were escorted out through a side door, cameras followed them, not with sympathy, but with scrutiny. Hale's face was set in anger now. Collins looked stunned, and Becker walked as if each step cost him something. The world they had taken for granted had shifted beneath their feet. Outside, the winter sun hung low but bright. Snow reflected the light, turning the courthouse steps into a sheet of white fire. Samuel stepped out into it slowly, blinking. The cold no longer felt hostile. It felt clean. Buddy lifted his head and sniffed the air, tail giving a tentative wag. For the first time that day, Samuel smiled. Outside the courthouse, the winter air felt lighter, as if the city itself had exhaled. The snow along the steps had been packed down by reporters and onlookers, their breath rising in pale clouds as they spoke in low, excited voices. Samuel Brooks stepped through the heavy doors slowly, Buddy still cradled in his arms, blinking at the sudden brightness. The late afternoon sun hung low over Cleveland, reflecting off the snow and glass buildings, turning the street into a field of quiet light. Emily Carter was waiting near the edge of the steps. She stood with her hands tucked into the pockets of her long gray coat, shoulders slightly hunched against the cold, auburn hair escaping from beneath her knit hat. Up close, the fatigue in her face was visible, dark circles beneath focused eyes, but so was something else. Resolve. Emily had grown up watching her mother cycle through shelters and temporary housing after a sudden divorce had shattered their stability. That childhood had shaped her into someone who believed that help should arrive before people learned to stop asking for it. When she saw Samuel, she straightened. "It's ready," she said quietly, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the moment. Samuel looked at her unsure. The courthouse noise faded behind him, replaced by the soft hum of traffic and the distant sound of a bus braking. Buddy shifted in his arms, tail flicking once. Emily reached into her coat pocket and produced a small key attached to a blue plastic tag. She placed it gently in Samuel's open palm. "Temporary housing," she said. "One room, warm, and they allow dogs." Samuel stared at the key. It was light, almost weightless, but his fingers trembled as they closed around it. "For both of us?" he asked. Emily nodded. "For both of you." Buddy lifted his head and licked Samuel's chin, as if sensing the change before Samuel fully could. A laugh escaped Samuel's chest. Soft, surprised, and quickly swallowed by emotion. He pressed his forehead briefly against Buddy's, breathing him in. "Thank you," Samuel said. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. Across the street, Daniel Wright spoke quietly with a city official. He wore the same simple coat as before, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed now that the weight of the courtroom had lifted. Daniel had already made his decision. The warehouse that had started this story would not remain just another redevelopment project. He had seen too much. "I'll fund the renovations," he said, his voice firm but calm. "Heating, beds, proper facilities. A place that doesn't feel like a last stop." The official blinked, surprised. "You're serious?" Daniel nodded. "I am." News cameras caught the exchange from a distance. By evening, headlines would link Daniel's name not just to construction but to shelter, to responsibility, to choice. Emily walked Samuel to a city van parked a block away. The driver, Ruth Patterson, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair cropped close and a face softened by years of listening, greeted them with a warm nod. Ruth had driven this route for over a decade, ferrying people between shelters, clinics, and housing units. She never rushed anyone. She knew how long it could take to trust a ride that promised something better. "Evening," Ruth said. "You must be Samuel. And your Buddy?" Buddy wagged his tail once, cautious but hopeful. The drive was quiet. Streetlights flickered on as dusk settled, their glow stretching across the snow-dusted sidewalks. Samuel watched the city pass by, familiar streets suddenly looking different, as if he were seeing them from a distance for the first time. Emily sat beside him, reviewing paperwork but glancing up often, checking in without asking. They arrived at a low brick building tucked between a clinic and a small park. It wasn't new, but it was clean. Warm light glowed from the windows. Inside, the room was small but real. A bed with a thick blanket. A chair. A sink. A heater humming softly against the wall. Samuel stood in the doorway, afraid to step in too quickly as if the space might vanish if he moved too fast. Emily waited. She knew that moment. The pause between survival and safety. "It's yours," she said gently, "as long as you need." Samuel stepped inside. That night, the city continued to buzz. The video from the courtroom spread across television and social media, replayed with captions calling for accountability and change. Community leaders spoke. Protest signs appeared and disappeared. The phrase spoken by Judge Lopez echoed across the state, printed on posters and shared in classrooms, churches, and city meetings. But Samuel heard none of it. He sat on the edge of the bed, Buddy curled tightly at his feet. He removed his coat slowly, folding it with care. The room smelled faintly of clean fabric and old paint. It smelled like possibility. For the first time in years, Samuel reached for a light switch. The bulb flickered once, then steadied. He turned it off. Darkness filled the room. Not the kind that threatened, but the kind that rested. Buddy sighed, stretching once before settling deeper against the floor, his breathing even and content. Samuel lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges. Appointments. Paperwork. Learning how to belong again. But tonight, the light had stayed on long enough. This story ends quietly, but its lesson does not. In our daily lives, we pass people like Samuel Brooks more often than we realize. On sidewalks, at bus stops, outside buildings we enter without thinking. It is easy to look away, to assume a story we do not know, to believe that rules matter more than people. But dignity is not a reward for good circumstances. It is a right that belongs to every human being. This story reminds us that kindness is not weakness, and silence is not always guilt. Sometimes survival looks like breaking a rule in order to protect a life. Sometimes, love shows up in the form of a trembling dog and a man who refuses to let go. Justice, at its best, does not ask who is powerful. It asks who is vulnerable. We are all responsible for the way the world feels to those who have less. The way we speak, the way we judge, the way we treat people who cannot give us anything in return. Change does not always begin with laws. It begins with seeing, listening, and choosing compassion when it is easier not to. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Your voice matters. If you believe in stories that teach us how to be better, consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue sharing meaningful stories together. And for everyone watching today, may God bless you, protect you, and soften your heart toward others. May He guide your actions with mercy and courage. If you believe that love and justice can still walk together, comment Amen below.